Well, hello there, everyone. Good evening. Hope everyone is doing well. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If I see a few people are watching live, if you can just give me a thumbs up or let me know that you can hear me in the comments, that would be greatly appreciated. And we'll get started here in just a minute. So, hey, everyone, I see everyone watching live. If you can see me, sorry, if you can hear me, I know you can see me. If you can hear me, please let me know in the comments that you can hear me and we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. No one said you can so far, but no one's also said you can't either. So that's usually a good sign. Hope everyone is doing well tonight, staying safe and healthy. Bear with me 1 minute here. We just got to do a couple of tech things to make sure that everything is going to work. Apologies, 1 second. And again, just let me know if anyone can't hear me or if you're having any issues with the feed. There we go. I just wanted to pull that up. Okay, perfect. You can hear me. Great, Bobby. Thank you so much for that. So good evening. I am very excited to talk to you a little bit about tonight about something that I'm very, very passionate about. And bear with me, I've lost my voice. I've been sick all week. So hopefully I make it through this without coughing or losing it again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Meg Wheeler. I'm running for state senate in the Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Norfolk district. And tonight I am presenting to you my plan for investing in our children. It's a plan covering universal childcare and early education, which is something that I believe is really missing here in Massachusetts. And so I'm very excited to share with you the plan and what I will be fighting for when I'm in the state senate. So we're going to go ahead and kick it off here. So I just want to pull this up here so you all can see my slides. And we'll get started. So the first thing I wanted to kick this off with is the very grim reality that Massachusetts has the second highest childcare costs in the United States. We're only second to the District of Columbia. Now, this maybe isn't that surprising given that, our housing costs are very high. It's one of the most expensive places to live. But when you think about a lot of other states like New York or California that also have very high costs in other areas, we have beaten them out in terms of the cost of childcare. So for all my parents out there, if you are feeling like that money you spend every single month just feels very burdensome, you're not wrong. You really are paying more than most Americans for your childcare for your kids. So childcare in Massachusetts on average is more expensive than in-state college tuition by about $7,000. And it's more expensive than the average rent by about 30%. So just to give you a sense of exactly where the costs are at, to send one infant child to infant care in Massachusetts, full-time infant care, is right around $20,000 on average. That price goes down to about $14,000 if it's an in-home center or an in-home facility versus a child care center, but still a pretty significant cost for many families to have to pay here in this state. So again, your $20,000 is more than what you would pay for that same child to go to one of our universities here and have a full year of college tuition. And it's also more than the rent in many places as well. Just to give you a sense of why this is such a huge issue. Excuse me. The government has essentially come out and said that affordable childcare is childcare that costs no more than 7% of your total household income. So that's that 7% number down there at the bottom. But here in Massachusetts, pretty much every childcare scenario exceeds that 7% marker right there. In fact, I believe the statistic said that only a little over 5% of Massachusetts families are actually meeting that criteria, that childcare isn't costing more than 7% of their household income. So to give you a few examples, if you have a household with 2 adults and 1 child here in Massachusetts, on average, your childcare is costing between about 10 and 16% of your household income. That's sort of the best case scenario, right? Is that you've got 2 working adults and only 1 child. If you add another child to that situation, the total cost of childcare compared to your household income goes up to anywhere between 20 and almost 29% of your household income. To give you a bit of a sense for where that falls, when you go to apply for a mortgage, for example, or even if you're looking at renting an apartment, they usually say you want your housing costs to be around 30% of your total income, right? So for two working adults with two children, childcare costs are really taking up the space that housing cost would take up. The situation is even more grim when you remove one of the working parents. And so now you have one working parent and one child. There, on average, childcare costs in Massachusetts are between about 44% and 69%. And then it gets even worse if you go to a single adult household, single working adult household with two children, where on average people are paying 84 to 120% of their total household income on childcare. That's where, of course, our voucher programs start to come into play. But as you can see, none of the scenarios in Massachusetts come anywhere close, with the exception of maybe two working adults and one child, to what the US government has deemed is affordable childcare, which is 7% or less of your household income. So this is a huge problem here in Massachusetts. Now, hold on, I need some tea. This is for the throat. Bear with me. So for the average minimum wage worker here in Massachusetts, so minimum wage currently just a little over $12, will get up to $15 in a couple of years per a bill that's already been passed by the legislation. But for that minimum wage worker, childcare costs take up more than 80% of their average annual income. So can you just imagine, and you may not have to imagine because this may be your scenario, where you get paid $1 and right off the bat, 80 cents is going to pay for childcare. It's impossible. It's unbearable. This is why this is a huge issue for us here. There was a study that was done just recently, about a year ago, I believe it was, and one of the takeaways was that nearly 2 in 5 Massachusetts children in working families actually don't have access to childcare. So this is another problem that sort of compounds the situation, which is not only is childcare in Massachusetts here incredibly expensive, but a lot of children and families actually don't even have access to childcare at all. So that's a problem that we need to solve for as well. So I wanted to just show you this chart real fast. So this is obviously the district that I'm running for. And what this shows is, a local organization essentially did research on what are called childcare deserts, which is, as you might imagine, areas essentially where there isn't enough childcare for the number of children that need it. And they essentially ranked all of the towns in Massachusetts from there's no gap, meaning there's no gap between the number of spots available in childcare and the number of kids that need it, to the worst, which was sort of the highest gap. And there's 5 different levels, right? So within our district, as you can see here, Hull, Cohasset, Scituate, Duxbury, these towns are in that second highest level, meaning they have a significant gap between the number of available childcare spots and the kids that actually need childcare. So there are many children in these towns that, even if they could afford childcare, wouldn't have access to childcare because there aren't spots available. Weymouth actually is split a little bit. So parts of Weymouth are in the middle group, and then parts of Weymouth have the second highest. So kind of that mid to second highest gap. And then Marshfield is at the highest gap level. So, the biggest gap you can have between available childcare spots and a number of kids that need childcare. So this childcare desert issue is an issue here in our district. And I think when we think about deserts, whether it's like a food desert or a housing desert or an education desert, I think many of us probably oftentimes think about these existing in more rural areas, in poorer areas. Our district is by no means one of the poorer districts. We're certainly not a rural district. And so I think it was very surprising to me to see that this childcare desert was an issue or is an issue here in our district, but it absolutely is, and a pretty significant one. So I also want to point out that our childcare workers are being left behind as well. So this is yet another problem with the current Massachusetts childcare industry. So the median wage for a childcare worker is about $13 per hour. Now that varies greatly depending on their level of education, but also depending on the type of facility they work in and the type of kind of education that they're providing. So kind of whether you're doing sort of just overseeing type babysitting type work to full on curricula, early education type work. But just to put that in comparison, kindergarten teachers make on average $41 an hour. So there's a pretty significant gap there between someone who is teaching your 2 or 3-year-old versus someone who is teaching, your 4 or 5-year-old in kindergarten. And for anyone who maybe doesn't have kids and is thinking, well, but this is childcare, not school. I mean, I can tell you, I have a couple of thoughts on that. But number one, I can tell you that my son's childcare, his daycare teachers are absolutely functioning as full teachers. They have curriculum, they are teaching lessons, obviously age appropriate, but they are engaging him all day. They're working with him all day. They are absolutely doing the job that a teacher does. And the second thing is, as a parent, and I'm sure I don't have to explain this to any parent, but as a parent, I want to know that the people taking care of my child are being well taken care of, because I want to make sure that they have all the available resources to do their job. I want to make sure that they're able to take care of their own families and their own living situations, so that they come into that classroom stable and happy, and able to really focus on giving my son the best education possible. So for me, this was a really staggering thing to see, this massive gap between what our childcare workers are being paid versus what our teachers are being paid. And I think most of us can probably agree that our teachers aren't being paid enough. So the situation is even worse when we think about our childcare workers. So I also wanted to point out that nearly 40% of childcare workers in Massachusetts receive some form of public assistance. And again, I think not surprising when you think about the fact that their average wages are $13 an hour. It is very impossible in the state of Massachusetts to function and live on $13 an hour, as I know many of you know. And it's something we absolutely need to change for everyone, not just for childcare workers. But in the context of talking about childcare tonight, I think this is a really staggering statistic that nearly 40% of our childcare workers receive some form of government assistance. So why does childcare matter? I mean, for those of us who are parents, we obviously love our kids. We want our kids to have the best possible. But why does this really matter? And when I lay out the plan that I'm going to lay out for you, which does cost a lot of money, why should you be comfortable with our state spending this kind of money to invest in this kind of a plan? There are four major benefits I want to touch on tonight. There are many more than this, but these four I think are particularly important. The first is better health outcomes, better social outcomes, better economic outcomes, and the last is a more equitable society. And I'm going to touch on all four as we go through here. So to start, let me get some more tea. Hold on. And for everyone joining who maybe wasn't here at the beginning, apologies for my voice, recovering from a bit of a cold. If you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll answer questions at the end. So I'm very happy to do that. So the first is better health outcomes. And there are a lot of studies on this, and I'm happy to send them to you if you're interested, or if there's a particular piece of it that you're wanting to learn more about. But overall, studies have basically found that when kids have access to quality childcare from very early on, that their health outcomes are better long term. One study in particular found that kids who had access to early education and childcare exhibited fewer risky behaviors by the time they turned age 21. So risky behaviors would be binging alcohol or smoking or using illegal drugs. So these kids exhibited fewer of those behaviors when they were 20, by the time they were 21, than their peers who had not had access to childcare experienced or exhibited. The second is, Chris wants to know what kind of tea I'm drinking. This is actually, I'll stop my very important conversation on childcare to tell you, because it's my secret, which is, it's a great drink. Now, I normally support my local coffee shops, big fan of Lucky Finn in Scituate, Seabird here in Cohasset, Red Eye in Hingham. But Starbucks does this drink called a medicine ball. Although, Chris, you'll appreciate this. The lawyers tell them, not me. The lawyers have told them apparently they can't call it a medicine ball anymore. So it's now called the honey citrus mint tea. And it's two different kinds of teas, peach and mint. or jade citrus mint with steamed lemonade, and I put 4 packs of honey in it, and it really helps with your throat. So if you ever have any throat issues, I highly recommend the medicine ball from Starbucks. But anyway, I digress. So the other, I think, important piece that came out of this study was that by the age of 30, kids or adults at the time who had access to childcare when they were young had lower risk for heart disease and associated factors. So obesity, high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, and high cholesterol than kids who had not gone through childcare. And again, I think for any of us, as parents who have put our kids into childcare, we know that childcare can really help in a lot of different ways. For many kids, it provides a consistent meal. Chris says, damn lawyers. Yep, I know. They're always killing it. But childcare provides consistent meals. It teaches kids about their bodies, and it teaches them, about healthy habits. And so I think it can be really, it's not surprising to me then that access to childcare really does lead to better health outcomes because it's starting that education young. So the next benefit are better social outcomes. And again, I don't think this is surprising to anyone with kids, and probably even not to the people who don't have kids. But by having access to early childcare, kids learn how to engage in different environments. They learn how to manage their own behaviors, whether it's physical or emotional behaviors. They tend to get along better with others. And again, I want to be very clear here at this point. This is not to say that if you've made the decision to not send your child to childcare, that that's a bad decision. Because a lot of the parents I know who have made that decision supplement that with other social interactions or experiences. So this is not a judgment thing at all by any means. But I do just want to point this out because I think it is really important to show that having access to childcare is really critical for children to gain the social and emotional skills that they need to be good citizens down the road. Having access to childcare also results in better economic outcomes for a variety of reasons. Now, here I've actually touched on the immediate economic outcome, which is the benefit of the parents being able to, or caregivers being able to work. But I also want to point out there are plenty of studies that show that kids who go through or have access to early childcare also are economically better themselves, because again, they've started out on the right foot. They've had that education from a very early age, and it sets them up for success down the line. But from the caregiver perspective, here in Massachusetts, if every single child had access to affordable, quality childcare, that would enable 34,000 caregivers to go back to work if they chose to do so. And I can tell you from many of the articles and studies that have been done that many caregivers have said that the reason they do not work is because of a lack of access to childcare. So this is absolutely an issue that's keeping those 34,000 people home. If they were to do so, if they were to go back to work or go to work at all, this would actually increase economic productivity by almost $5 billion. So when we're going through what we're going through right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're having a lot of conversations about how to get our economy back on track, how to really revitalize this. I think we cannot ignore the fact that a lack of access to childcare, even before COVID, we're going to talk about COVID's impact in a second, but the lack of access to childcare even before COVID was keeping so many people either underemployed or unemployed. And one of the best ways to reinvigorate our economy is to increase our productivity. Okay, so there's a huge opportunity here, almost $5 billion. I also want to point out that studies have shown that every dollar invested in early education actually returns more than $7 of discounted returns over the lifetime of the child. This is through increased economic productivity. It's through decreased health and social services costs, or it's through a lot of different ways. But every dollar we invest in childcare, we're getting a $7 return on that money. And I think that's really important for us to remember as well. I would take a 7x return any day. So again, better economic outcomes is a really huge benefit of access to early childcare. And lastly, I think one of the biggest benefits is that having full access to universal or to childcare in general levels the playing field for so many people. We're having a lot of conversations right now about systemic racism and about how we can really overcome the huge discrepancies in the opportunity gap between between white people and Black people because of years and years and years and years of just discrimination and racist policies in housing and education, in the workforce, in voting, that has resulted in our Black communities just not being as far along economically as our white communities are. And so having access to childcare is one of the best ways that we can decrease that gap, because it levels that playing field for children regardless of where they live, regardless of their family's socioeconomic status. It also, childcare still, even in this day and age, disproportionately falls on women to manage. And so when we're thinking about this childcare issue, by having access to quality childcare for every single child, this enables more women to be gainfully employed. It helps narrow that gender pay gap by putting more women back into the workforce and enabling them to continue their careers instead of having to take a step back to raise children, if that's what they choose to do so. Again, respecting everybody's choices here. It also, having access to, or complete access to childcare, I should say, returns social, emotional, and health benefits for the caregivers. So we talked a lot about how this benefits the kids, but it also benefits the caregivers. There was a study they did, so I'm blanking on who did it. I can find it if anyone wants to know. Again, I think it was a year or two ago, where they essentially looked at the benefits to the caregivers of having their kids in childcare, because what was happening was it was creating social networks for those caregivers. Even if it was something as minimal as just dropping your kid off and picking them up every day. So just a quick conversation with some of the other parents, it was creating a social community that was resulting in, they saw over the life of the study, that lower income, they looked specifically at women in this study, that lower income mothers, women, were 40% less depressed than their equivalents who did not have their kids in a childcare where they had that social environment. And then higher income women were 60% less depressed than their equivalents who kept their kids home. So I thought that was really striking as well, that there are benefits to the caregivers, very much so, and those benefits do tend to help women more, because women disproportionately bear the childcare burden. So this all sounds great, right? Lots of benefits. Well, how do we actually make progress in this? Oh, yeah, and I wanted to point out this statistic, kind of going to what I was just saying, that being out of the workforce for just 5 years, which is a very normal amount of time that a lot of women will step out of the workforce for to raise their children, can cost women 20% or more of their lifetime earnings potential. So 5 years and you lose 20% of your lifetime earnings potential. We already have a gender pay gap. This exacerbates it so much that I don't think it's possible to minimize that gap in our lifetime, certainly if we do not solve this childcare issue. So I was anxious to get to the plan. I was like, let's talk about the plan, but I forgot. I wanted to tease the pain point a little bit more before we get there, because this situation is even more dire now because of COVID, right? So this was already a big issue. In fact, all of the numbers I've shown you are pre-COVID numbers. None of those factor in the impact of increased daycare costs, because of COVID precautions. These are all pre-COVID issues. But the situation is more dire now because of COVID. These are just a few headlines I grabbed over the last few months. Coronavirus childcare crisis will set women back a generation. I would argue it's probably even more than a generation, Report, mass school funding formula gives wealthy districts more aid than they need, widening equity gaps. That one wasn't specifically about childcare. It was about our public education funding. But if you think about the fact that they're highlighting that they're already widening these equity gaps in our public schools, well, having a lack of access to childcare is going to make that even worse, right? Agencies scramble to offer school day childcare. We know that this is a huge issue with the pandemic going on. Childcare centers faced with myriad challenges as school districts start remote learning. I know of many childcare centers that have closed down. So I think we're going to see the costs go even higher. We're going to see those childcare deserts get even bigger as a result of the pandemic. This is a huge problem because of everything that's going on right now. Also, and this is a during pandemic statistic here is that I believe this may have been WBUR who did a survey, and they found that 1 out of 4 women who became unemployed during the pandemic said it was because of a lack of childcare, twice the rate among men. So just think about that. So women are being twice as burdened by the lack of childcare because of the pandemic than men are. So again, we're further widening that equity gap. And the statistic is even worse when you look at women of color and people who are in disenfranchised communities. So this is a really huge issue. So what is the plan? Now we can talk about the plan. I'm excited to get to plan. I do need tea. Hold on. So the plan is investing in our children, universal childcare and early education for all. And I'm very excited to outline this plan for you today. I'm also very excited to have this be the very first bill I write when I get into the Massachusetts State Senate, because I think this is so critically important for all the reasons that I've just talked about. Whether or not you are a parent, I think solving the childcare crisis benefits everybody. If we're spending less money dealing with the negative impacts of this childcare crisis, then that's more money we can put into other things that we all care about, like the climate crisis, or reforming healthcare, or affordable housing, or restoring our economy, reinvigorating our communities. So there's so many possibilities if we fix this crisis that really benefit everybody, whether or not you have children. So there are 3 primary components of this plan. The first is to offer universal affordable childcare to every single child in the state of Massachusetts. The second is to offer free full-day kindergarten to every eligible by age child in Massachusetts. And the third is to ensure a livable wage for all childcare workers here in the state. I'm going to go over each aspect of these plans. I'm also going to plug my computer in a hot second because I didn't do that before, and we're going to lose power. So hold on, I'm going to do that. I'll talk and plug as I scare my poor dog who is sleeping next to me. So so the first part of this, hold on. Okay. Excuse me. We're going to put it there for a moment. I got a few more minutes before I lose it. So so the first part of this is the universal affordable childcare piece. For anyone who was a fan of Senator Elizabeth Warren or watched her in the presidential debates, you'll notice that this is very similar to her plan. We looked at her plan. We looked at other plans that legislators all over the country have put forward for universal childcare. We also looked at several plans that people within our own state had put forward a few years ago. They didn't, unfortunately, didn't make it very far, but we looked at all of those different plans to really understand what would make the most sense here in Massachusetts. So what this would entail is that the state would basically create a network of diverse, quality childcare options. So, and there's a lot of buzzwords in there, so I want to touch on every single one of them. So the first is diverse. When I say diverse, we mean in a variety of ways, but one of the most important ways we mean is geographically diverse. And this really gets to the childcare desert. So there would be written into the bill requirements to ensure that there are available childcare options within a certain distance to every single child in the state of Massachusetts, so that no child is stuck not having access because they live in a rural area or they live in an area where there isn't a lot of childcare options set up at the moment. The second is quality. So this actually kind of goes to the second bullet point as well, but we would adopt incredibly high standards for these centers, very much in line with if anyone is in the military and has had access to their military childcare programs, looking at standards that they set, looking at the Head Start standards, obviously working with local educators to really ensure that these standards ensure that our childcare centers are appropriately up to speed for our kids. The childcare options themselves would also be varied. So they would include both what you think of as kind of childcare centers, but also in-home options. I think it's really important to recognize that that quality childcare doesn't have to fit into a certain mold. I think we're noticing this now, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, where people are being forced to figure out some other non-traditional options. And so this program would not not discriminate against options that perhaps don't fit that traditional mold. I talked about the high standards a bit already. The crux of this is really that childcare costs for every single family would be capped at 7% of household income. So this is really the key piece of it, right? And if you go back to one of the first slides I showed you, remember right now families in Massachusetts are paying anywhere between 10% and 120% of their household income on childcare. So this would cap it at 7%. So for pretty much every single person, this would result in a reduction in your childcare costs. It puts significant amount of money back into families' pockets to spend. In fact, I believe the estimate is on average about $13,000 per family that you'd have in your pocket to spend on the other necessities. Childcare would also be offered free for income under 200% of the federal poverty level. And again, that's very much in line with the other universal childcare plans that are out there. So, and just to give you an estimate of that, actually the next slide shows this, I believe. Yep. So the federal poverty level, 200% of the federal poverty level is about $50,000. I think it's like $51,000 right now. So in this example where you have 2 working adults and 2 children, and your household income is $50,000, that family doesn't have to pay for quality childcare. It would be completely free to that family. In this second example, same 2 adults, working adults, same 2 children, household income of $125,000. The estimate is about $730 a month that they would pay for childcare. That's that 7% cap. The way it would work essentially is the amount you would pay if you were above the 200% above the poverty level, up to the 7% is the amount you would pay would essentially be calculated on a rolling scale, depending on where your household income is, how many kids you've got, what level of childcare they're in. But again, ultimately capped at that 7%. So you will not pay more than 7%. That compares to that same family paying for 2 children right now is probably paying on average about $3,000 a month for childcare, assuming both kids are in childcare. So pretty significant savings there every single month. So the other thing that I want to point out, because there's always somebody who wants to know, well, okay, that sounds great, but how's it going to be implemented? So childcare centers would actually be provided both time and resources to adhere to these standards. I believe the sort of general time frame that I've heard that seems reasonable by most accounts is about 2 years. So essentially the bill would become law and childcare centers would have about 2 years to adapt if they needed to any of the standards of this program to be part of this program. It would also give the state that time to bring those childcare centers into the program. And the idea is that most, if not all, childcare centers in the state would want to be part of this program because it's not only enabling them to bring people in to where it's affordable for the families, but they're also getting paid by the state. That's reliable income for them. There would be statewide standards, again, to ensure that these childcare centers are adequately taking care of our kids, but there would also be room for local input and adjustments to adhere to the specifics of each community. We understand that not every community is the same, and we obviously want to make sure that none of these centers are being held back by regulations that don't make sense to their particular environment. So it'd be a bit of a balance between the two. So the next component of the Investing in Our Children plan is the free full-day kindergarten. Now, 86% of districts in Massachusetts already offer free full-day kindergarten. So the good thing about this component of the plan is it's actually not that hard to implement because so many of the districts already include this. However, what would happen even for those districts is the law would require that every district offer this. And so even in those districts where it currently exists, if the district ever wanted to pull it back, this law would prevent them from being able to do that. Now, in the district that I'm running for, the Plymouth and Norfolk district, which is Weymouth down to Duxbury, so Weymouth, Cohasset, Hingham, Hull, Scituate, Marshfield, Norwell, and Duxbury, 6 of the 8 towns in the district do not have free full-day kindergarten. I've put in parentheses there with the exception of Weymouth would be the third town to get it. They have just decided to offer it this year on a trial basis. They had essentially a fund of money set aside to bring this in. It's unclear if the funding will be there in the future. So that's why I don't include that right now in the towns. So it's kind of like 5 to 6 of the towns. I hope that it goes very well for them. I hope they're able to continue to fund it. But even if they are, that's still only 3 of the 8 towns in our district that offer free full-day kindergarten. The other towns that don't offer it charge between $3,500 and $5,000 per year, which sure is, a blessing after you've been paying $20,000 per year for your childcare, but is still incredibly burdensome to families in our district, and is frankly a cost that I just don't think they should have to take on. It's a cost that the state should really ensure that kindergarten is being offered. So this is a map, obviously, of the entire state, and this shows you where there's free full-day kindergarten. So any towns or cities that are in white have free full-day kindergarten currently. This is as of 2019 through 2020. So this does not reflect the fact that Weymouth is trying free full-day kindergarten this year. And then if you look at the colors, kind of that light peach charges about $1,750 to $2,950 per year. The sort of like medium peach, $3,000 to $3,475 per year. That's 13 communities. The bright peach, or the dark peach, I should say, charges $3,500 to $5,000 per year for free full-day kindergarten. That's 25 communities, including 5 of the 8 in our district. And then purple is they don't have free full-day kindergarten available at all, and that's 1 community. So just to zoom in real fast, I know this is a little blurry. And again, I do want to remind you this is 2019 to 2020. So Weymouth has since, for starting this year, is offering free full-day kindergarten. Again, I don't know if that's going to be on a permanent basis, but currently they're being reflected on this map as charging $3,500 to $5,000. That is not the case this year. But you can see the rest of the communities, Hingham, Cohasset, Scituate, Norwell, and Duxbury, offer free full-day kindergarten, but charge somewhere between $3,500 and $5,000 for it. Only Marshfield and Hull are offering it completely for free. So, excuse me, and actually, now would be a good time. We're going to do a quick little mini break so that I can plug in my computer. Okay, apologies for the break. Hopefully you can still hear me. So the last part of the Investing on Our Children plan that we'll be rolling out when I'm in the state Senate is ensuring a livable wage for childcare workers. So first and foremost, and this isn't just specific to childcare workers, I want to put a bill forward that increases the mandatory minimum wage to $17 an hour, which is essentially the amount that MIT has come out and said is a livable wage for one single person with no children. That's like the baseline, right? I actually would love to get it higher, but we're going to start with $17 an hour. So we're going to increase that mandatory minimum to $17 an hour. This will benefit childcare workers because their minimum wage will go to that level. But I also want to take it one step further for childcare workers and put a plan in place to increase their wages so that they better align with those of comparable public school teachers. Now, I understand that there may be some differences. Public school teachers obviously go through, typically have bachelor's degrees, and have gone through more education and training potentially, and that'll be recognized. But I still think we need to recognize the fact that many of our childcare providers are essentially providing a similar level of education and care for our children, and it's not being reflected in what they're being compensated with. So this plan would ensure that that happens. Excuse me, and that depending on the level of education and experience and type of work they're doing, that there would be set minimums for compensation for those folks if these centers participate in this plan. Hold on. Okay. So I know the big question is, well, what's this going to cost? This is what everybody always wants to know, right? And also, how do we pay for it? So the best estimate I can give you right now is that the likely cost of this plan is somewhere around $1.7 billion per year. Now, this is a really rough estimate. This is based on Moody's did an analysis actually of Senator Elizabeth Warren's plan, and they did it for the entire country, and it was essentially about $70 billion per year to help about 12 million children. So we've essentially used those numbers and applied them in this case. Now, this number does factor in the immediate economic benefit. So, that increased productivity I talked about, It does not necessarily factor in kind of long-term economic benefits, and it doesn't factor in any offsets for what we're currently spending. So, for example, 86% of our school districts, right, are currently have free full day kindergarten. So they've already budgeted for that. They're already spending money for that. So, this plan doesn't factor, or this number, estimate doesn't factor that in. We're also providing currently vouchers for childcare for many of our residents, not nearly as many as we should be, but for many of our residents. This $1.7 billion does not factor in the cost of those vouchers. That would obviously be an offset that would bring this down. But in the interest of starting this conversation, I wanted to be more conservative with the numbers here because I wouldn't ever want to put something out there and then have it be so much more and have anyone feel as though I wasn't being transparent. So approximately $1.7 billion a year. My hope is that that would end up being significantly less because of some of the things I've just mentioned. But that's the number we're working at. To give you a sense of how we would pay for this, we have a lot of options, actually. I've listed 4 here, but I will tell you there's at least 20 different ways that we could come up with to pay for this. Now, and none of those ways, for the record, actually involve taking money out of anything else in our budget right now. So allocating money from one thing to another. We could do that too. That's one way we could. We could look at another area where we're spending money and say that's not as important. Let's move it over to this. But I'm not recommending that. I'm not suggesting that right now. I'm actually saying we have an opportunity to raise more revenue to pay for this. So a few of the options that I've put here, and again, there are many beyond this. The first is we could actually raise our corporate tax rate. So I think it was 2010. Don't quote me on the year. We reduced our corporate tax rate down to essentially what the state 5% rate is. And it used to be, I believe, like 9.75%. It used to be significantly higher. That's absolutely something that we could bring back. And I think if you look at big corporations in Massachusetts and you look at the economic studies they've done around this, and again, I'm happy to geek out on this stuff with anybody if you want to dive into the details. But there are no studies that have shown that this would negatively affect our economy by bringing these taxes back up to the pre-2010 levels. This alone would bring in anywhere from $375 to $500 million per year. So if we did that, that would potentially get us a third of the way there just by that one tax increase. And again, that's corporate taxes. This is not, this is not going to affect your income taxes. It's not going to affect your property taxes. The second option is to increase the capital gains and or dividend income tax. And this is, I think, a really critical one. A lot of folks have been talking about this on the federal level as well, because essentially this tax really only affects the top 1%. It affects so few families here in Massachusetts, but it brings in $840 million every single year, $840 million. That gets us more than, or just about half the way there every single year if this is the only thing we do. And again, it affects so few of our families. So, and there would obviously be carve-outs for, sales of your personal residence and things like that. No average working family is going to pay any money if we do this capital gains tax. I promise you that. The third option is one that is maybe less talked about, but I think is a really interesting one, which is to actually add a tax, even a very minimal tax. They're not talking about a large tax at all, maybe 1% to 2% on large endowments. So this would be the Harvard universities of the world. These are endowments that have significant assets, $40 billion plus, the majority of which have never been subject to tax. And while I am a huge proponent of higher education and I fully support colleges, and the work that they do, and I recognize the importance of endowments to continuing that work, I think there's a point at which you can say enough is enough. When you've got $40 billion sitting there, that is very, very little of it is being touched every single year. And it's continuing to grow significantly. I think saying, we're going to put a minor tax on that is something we really need to be talking about. That alone would bring in $1 billion. So that alone would pay for more than half of this plan. I mean, can you imagine if that's all we did and we could give every single kid in this state access to affordable quality childcare? I mean, this is not rocket science. The last thing to consider to look at is what's essentially called the millionaire's tax. And the way this has been proposed is a 4% surtax on incomes over $1 million. It's estimated to bring in about $2 billion every year. So if this is the only thing we do, we would more than cover the costs. I'm all for people being millionaires. I like many of you, probably, hope we can all be one someday. But the reality is the majority, not even just majority, the super majority of people in Massachusetts are not millionaires and probably never will be. And instead are struggling to afford affordable childcare. They're struggling to afford their homes. They're struggling to afford healthcare. They're struggling to afford higher education. So when we have people out there, a very, very small group of people for whom we add a 4% tax and we bring in $2 billion every single year, that pays for every single child in Massachusetts to have access to affordable quality childcare, to me, that does not feel like a tough decision. So any one of these things could be passed and it would make a significant dent in the cost for this childcare and early education plan. Do just a couple of them and we're there without having to touch anything else in the budget. I've said this before, but there's been a lot of talk this year with COVID. Hold on, I need more tea. There's been a lot of talk this year with COVID about dwindling state revenues and how are we going to come up with money to afford what we need to do. I've said it before, I will say it again till I'm blue in the face. What we spend money on is what we prioritize. The problem is not that we don't have money. The problem is, where is our money going? And right now, not enough of our money is going to childcare, to education, to affordable housing. Excuse me. We are not prioritizing these things. The State House, just passed, or a year ago, gosh, it's been a year, almost a year, passed the Student Opportunity Act, $1.5 billion Student Opportunity Act, which is great. I'm so excited. You know what's lacking in that bill? A funding mechanism. They passed this awesome bill without any requirement for how it gets funded. So now we're in a position this year where it's essentially up to the governor to fund the portion of the Student Opportunity Act to make sure that it actually happens, that our kids get the resources they need. And we're in a pandemic. And the message we're hearing is dwindling revenues. We can't afford these things. It's all about priorities. We can afford it if it matters to us. So what the state is saying right now, and what I'm hearing from too many legislators, is we just don't care enough about our kids. And as I've shown you on this slide, those are just 4 ways that we can raise revenue right now to cover something like universal childcare, to cover free full day kindergarten for this district. We can do that with those 4 options right there. And like I said, I've got 15 more that we could consider as well. These are just the biggest and the most known. So this is not about not having the money. This is not about prioritizing what really matters. And that's why when I'm in the state Senate, childcare and early education funding is going to be my top priority, not just because I'm the mom of a 3-year-old, but because I see every single day how families are struggling to afford this very basic need that is so critical. It's so determinative in the outcomes of our children, in their health, their social, their emotional well-being, in their economic opportunities, inequality in this society, both for women, for people of color. This is so critical to overcoming so much of what we struggle with. And it does so much for families. I mean, imagine if you had $13,000 more in your pocket every single year. Imagine what you could do with that. We've got a lot of other things we need to reform too. We need to reform healthcare. Excuse me. We need to reform housing. And those are things I'm excited to work on as well. And we need to do all of them. I want to be very, very clear. Universal childcare does not get us the full way there, but it gets us so much further along the path to being able to give families what they need and give children what they need. And this is truly an investment in our future. Because again, even if you don't have children, we are investing in the people who are going to run our society and our economy in the future. I want to make sure that we set them up for success as much as possible. So $1.7 billion a year, it's a big number, but it's not a big number when I think about what it gets us in return. And I think about what it does for working families, what it does for children, what it does for our society. So for me, this is a no-brainer. And when I hear politicians say, well, we can't afford it, that really frustrates me, because what they're really saying is this isn't important enough for us to figure out how to do it. My approach is, if it's important, we've got to figure it out. We have to find a way, because there is not an option. There is not an option to ignore this. We cannot ignore the childcare crisis in our state and in our country right now. We have to act now. If we don't act now, all of these things that I've talked about are going to perpetuate the inequality, the injustice, the struggles that our working families are going through. Families are getting poorer and poorer and poorer every single year. It's getting harder and harder for families to build up any kind of wealth in this country. Almost impossible for the majority of families to do that in this country. And it's because of three primary things: healthcare, housing, and childcare. This solves one of those prongs. We've got to work on the other two, no question. But this takes care of one of the biggest. And here in Massachusetts, we are the state with the second highest childcare costs in the country. And go back to the original numbers I told you. We are paying more for childcare here in Massachusetts than we would pay to send that same child to a full year of in-state college. We are paying more for childcare here in Massachusetts than the average rent by 30%. This is a crisis, and it's gotten worse because of COVID, and we don't have a choice. This is a problem we have to figure out how to fix. And it's a problem that I am so extremely passionate about and excited to work on when I'm in the state Senate, because I know the value of fixing this problem for the families in our district, for every single person in our district, and for every single person in our state. So I'm very excited to put this plan forward for all of you. If you are excited about this plan as well, if you believe that Massachusetts deserves universal childcare and our district deserves free full-day kindergarten, please go to megwheeler.com/childcare, sign the pledge, show your support for this plan. And then join me when I'm in the state Senate and help me get this passed, so that we can really bring this equality and this investment in our children to Massachusetts. So I'm going to leave it there. We've got some questions I wanted to address. And if you are watching live and have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. So let me go ahead and let's see if I can do this. Tech. We love the tech. Okay, we're going to pull this up, and let's bring our questions up as well. Okay, and I don't have names on who asked these questions. I apologize. But the first question is, how quickly can we get this plan up and running? Yeah, it's a great question. So look, my goal, let's actually back up a second. So when I'm in the state Senate, so I would get into the state Senate starting in January of 2021. And the way the State House works is essentially you put bills forward at the beginning, and then it's a 2-year cycle, right? So you spend essentially the next year and a half. Those bills go into committee, they get discussed, they have hearings, and then the bills three things happen when they're in committee. They can either be voted out of committee, meaning they're essentially sent to the Senate and or the House to be voted on. They can be voted down, so they're not sent out for a vote, they die. Or they can be sent what's called to study, which is essentially a nicer way of putting a bill to die. It's basically saying we need to study this more, but the reality is when a bill is sent to study, it usually doesn't go any further than that. So that process happens, and then this bill would essentially come to the floor, be voted on in the Senate, voted on in the House, And then a conference committee would negotiate any differences between the Senate and the House versions of the bill. And that can take, a year and a half, give or take. So we're now in the second year of the two-year legislative session. And that's what you saw going on a lot in May and June, was the Senate and the House were voting on things. And now the few remaining bills that they both voted on are in conference committee to get the details ironed out. And then they'll hopefully get voted on, passed, sent to the governor to be signed. So you figure best case, this is a 2-year cycle to get the bill put out there, voted on, and passed. And I'll be completely candid with you, a bill of this nature, a bill of this size, that's a big task to get it through in that one cycle, which is why it's the first thing we're going to do when we get into the Senate. And in fact, we're not waiting until we get there to start work on this. We've already written the bill. We're already starting to build coalitions of partners so that when we get to the state Senate, we're ready to hit the ground running and get supporters on board for this bill so that we are ready to go. We can get it through committee. We can get people on board. But this is where you all come into play. This is what's so important about every single one of you for any bill that you support, is reaching out to your elected officials and making sure they know you support it. Going when they have hearings in the committees, going and speaking, talking about childcare and how much of a burden it is and how important this bill would be for you. So that's all a really important piece of the process. But that's about 2 years, right? Then I suspect we'll need about a 2-year onboarding period. Now, I think there are pieces that can happen sooner. So for example, I think the free full day kindergarten can happen a lot sooner, right? Again, 86% of our towns already have that. So it's just a question of getting the remaining ones up and running. I think that's the kind of thing that can happen as soon as the bill is passed within kind of that next budget cycle. But the actual universal childcare system, this network of childcare providers, that's going to take a little bit of time, both for the state to get everything up and running, but also for the childcare centers to get up to date on any standards that get set that they need to be up to date on, to get the entire system in place. How does the user system piece of it work? So how do I, when I pay for my childcare, how does that work? How do I apply? How do I get into the system? So I figure that's probably a 2-year process as well. So you may be talking about 4 years. And that's why I say this is so critical for us to do now. And this, I think, is something that we often forget, is we think, this is a big deal right now. We'll just rush in there and pass a bill and it'll be fixed. But even if we could write this bill today and have it voted tomorrow, it would still be a period of time before it's up and running. And that's why it's so critical we work on this stuff now, because we know coming out of COVID that the childcare crisis is going to be worse. It already is worse. It's going to continue to get worse. More centers are going to close down. And so in order to solve this problem, we need to be working on this now. That's another thing. I didn't touch on this, I don't think, when I was going through the slides, but a piece of this bill also includes providing opportunities for new childcare centers to open, especially in places that are currently childcare deserts. So that's a piece of it as well. But again, that takes time. Will we still be able to keep our kids at their regular daycare? Yeah, absolutely. So the goal would be to have every single daycare in the state of Massachusetts be part of the network. And the key there is to make it attractive to daycares to be a part of this. So unlike with healthcare, where the reimbursement rates are usually pretty crappy compared to private pay, this bill doesn't call for that. This bill is going to call for appropriately priced reimbursement rates for childcare centers that ensure that they can cover their costs and do their business, and that they're not struggling to get by, so that they want to be a part of the system. Because remember, being a part of the system means that, in effect, a good percentage of the tuition that they're paid comes from the state and is therefore reliable, right? It's stable. They know they can count on the state to pay that every single month. So it's really beneficial to childcare centers to be a part of it, as long as we make it attractive for them to do so. So my goal would be that every single center in the state is a part of it. There may be some that aren't. So yes, there is a small chance that your daycare wouldn't be. But again, I think it's on us as the legislators to make this attractive for those childcare centers to want to participate. Okay, will daycare suffer because of this plan? Yeah, so kind of speaking of what I just said, no. And again, I mean, I think it's on us to ensure that the way the bill's written and implemented doesn't hurt daycares. But I mean, again, the goal here isn't to pay daycare centers less. It's to do a couple of things. Remember, we're also expecting daycares to pay their childcare providers more, right? So their costs are actually going to go up. There's no question about that. But the reimbursement rates that we pay them we need to make sure that those adequately cover those increased costs so that again our daycares are not suffering. We already know daycares, we know many daycares that have shut down, right? Because they couldn't afford the costs during COVID. Um, the more that happens, the more of these childcare deserts we end up with. And this isn't a problem for just the people in the western part of the state or the rural parts. This is a problem here in our district. And I think we're going to continue to see it be a problem as the pandemic continues on and as more and more centers close. So we need to make sure that this bill is written in a way that is attractive to childcare facilities, and we need to make sure that the implementation is done effectively so that childcare facilities buy into this and it's easy for them and it's financially beneficial for them to be a part of this system, because everyone wins if we all are part of this system and can implement this correctly. So great question for that. Thank you for that. All right, so hold on, more tea. I don't think I see any more questions in the comments, but if this last call for questions. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them in the comments, or you can reach out to us at hello@megwheeler.com. And I do just want to remind everyone that if you are excited about this, or if you want to learn more about this plan, or if you want to pledge your support for this plan and help us show the state and our elected officials that there is support behind having universal childcare here in Massachusetts, please head to megwheeler.com/childcare, read about the plan, let us know if you have any questions, sign the pledge. And I really just appreciate your time tonight. This is something I'm very, very passionate about, very excited to bring this to the Massachusetts State Senate. I'm excited to have this be the first bill I write when I get in there. And I'm looking forward to celebrating with all of you when we get this passed and we finally bring universal childcare to every single child in Massachusetts. So thank you everyone so much. I hope you are all staying safe and healthy, and have a wonderful night.